Fire was discovered hundreds of thousands of years ago, and ever since it has been providing us with many benefits, including heat, a cooking source, and a light source. Over these countless years, humans have discovered many different ways to creating fires. One of the methods is the bow drill technique. The bow drill method is one of the most efficient friction methods when starting a fire if done correctly. I've successfully used this technique a few times before. A couple of things that you will need is wood, a knife, some string, and a handhold. 3 points that I'm going to be going over are I'm going to introduce the supplies, the setup, and then go through the procedure. First things first, let's go through what you're going to need to start your fire. The supplies you will need first are you're going to need a hearth board. Typically it's a softwood, and I chose cedar. And one of the things you're going to want to do to check to see if it's going to be a good softwood is if you press your fingernail in it, it should leave an indent, and that should be a good sign. Another thing is that I like to get a piece that's about 1 inch by 4 inches, and this is because that way you can cut down a section of the wood, and you can use that piece to create your spindle. The spindle is what's used to create the friction, and the most important part of the spindle is that it's straight. You don't want a piece that's crooked, because that way when you roll it, it's not going to roll very efficiently and the friction won't go very well. Another thing that's important is that you want to cut facets in the top side of the wood and to create a point, and this will be the top that you have the handhold resting on. The bottom end, however, you're going to create smaller facets and make the bottom more rounded off, and it can still have a little bit of a point to it. You just want to make sure that it's flatter than the top is. The next thing is the bow. The bow is just a normal piece of wood that I found outside. The only thing is I like to find ones that have a Y in the top, but this is just to make it easier to attach the string later on. People can use many different types of string, ropes, or just cord, and it doesn't really matter if it's braided or single-stranded, it's just whatever you prefer. All I bought was a piece of braided rope from the hardware store, and it seems to work pretty well for me. The next things you're going to need are a handhold. Handholds can be made out of many different items, including bottle caps, the plastic tops to canteens, or even seashells. But the one that I found that I like the best is I like using my niece's little Elmo spoon, because it's got a nice smooth surface to reduce friction, and its rounded shape makes it easier to push down and provide pressure when you're actually spinning the spindle. Now that you have all the supplies together, let's begin with the setup. First thing we're going to set up is the drill. What you're going to want to do is you're going to take a 2.5, almost 3 foot piece of string and just wrap it around the bottom and tie it off. It doesn't really matter how you tie it off so long as it's just on there nice and tight. And then what you're going to want to do is just tie off just a tiny little loop at the end. Again, it doesn't really matter how you create the loop so long as it's big enough to just slide down onto the top of the Y. And the Y makes it so it doesn't fall off. And if you notice the tension on the string isn't very tight, and that's fine. It's better for it to be too loose than for it to be too tight, because what you can do is when you're using it, you can always take your thumb and press down on the string to adjust the tension depending on how you want it or how you feel comfortable using it. And then the next thing that we're going to be setting up is the hearth board. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take your spindle and line up the edge of the spindle with the edge of the hearth board. This is just to find where the center of the spindle is going to lie on the board. And then you can just mark it with your finger and then take your knife. I like to use a multi-purpose tool. It's easier. Some people use saws, and it doesn't really matter. All you do is just cut a little divot into it. That way the bottom of the spindle can rest into the little divot that you created. You're then going to use your bow, and how you thread this is you stick the bottom end of the spindle, which is the rounded section, in between the string and the stick. You're then going to twist the bottom out away from the stick and then down. This wraps the string around without actually overlapping and twisting. And what you're going to want to do next is it's called mating the spindle with the hearth board. You're going to stick it into the little divot and you're going to take your handhold and you're going to press down on it. And what you're going to do is just apply a little bit of pressure on the top while spinning it. You don't have to spin it very fast at all. It's just to get a nice indentation into the wood. And what it'll look like afterwards is something about like this. It's not very big and it doesn't need to be. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to take your knife again and you're going to use it to cut a triangle at the edge of the divot. I already have this one created and the lines are shown here. So you just cut the triangle, making the top smaller than the bottom, and use your knife to just pop out the chunk of wood. What this does is this creates an opening for the embers to fall down from when the stick rubs against the wood, but you don't want it to be too big so that when you're spinning the spindle, it can just slide off or fall through the hole. A few of the extra things that you're gonna want to have ready are the tinder, which it can be made of anything from bark to dried leaves or moss. I like to use the bark of cedar trees. Just rub it up in a big ball in my hand. It's nice and fibrous, so it catches fire pretty easily. And then you're going to want a piece of bark about the size of your hand, and this is just to place underneath the divot and the notch that you made in your hearth board, just to collect the embers that fall so they don't fall into the damp ground and go out. Now that the setup is complete, we'll move on to the procedure of working the actual drill. So what you're going to want to do is thread up your drill again by putting it in between and then twisting outward and downward. And then you're going to set the bottom end of the spindle into the little divot that you created, taking your handhold and pushing down and applying pressure. One thing that helps make this a lot easier is placing your foot on the end of the board that you're not drilling into, and this just creates an anchor so it helps so it doesn't move around. And then the same thing goes for, you can use your knee of the foot you're using to provide pressure. You can wrap your arm around it and use it as an anchor for your arm and your handhold, so that way your hand doesn't move around or wiggle either. And then all you're going to want to do is just start off by placing your foot on the board and then your arm around your knee, and you're just going to apply a little bit of pressure and then move the stick a few times until you start to see smoke. Once the smoke starts to thicken, you're going to want to apply just a little bit more pressure and then speed up the drill as you go. This should create more embers and they'll just fall through the little notch that we created and onto the bark. So then you'll just take the bark out from underneath the board, and you can take your time with this. It won't burn out right away, and you'll just dump the embers into the little tinder nest that you made, and just by fanning it lightly or letting the wind blow on it, it should catch fire within a couple minutes. I wouldn't recommend blowing on it though, because that might actually just blow out the ember and then you'll have to start all over again. You have just learned the bow drill fire starting method, and using the bow drill technique is one of the easiest and most efficient friction fire starting methods to use. The 3 points were the supplies, the setup, and the procedure. Learning how to start a fire using unconventional methods is not only a great tool to have, but it can also be a great confidence booster and a fun trick to show your friends or your family.